Hey everyone, welcome back to a brand new video. Today we're going to be doing a deck profile of a rogue deck from the 2010 Worlds format, MetaGon, or Metagross Flygon. This is a list that I've been working with recently. Only gotten a few games practicing with it, but from my results so far, the deck seems to be pretty decent. So I wanted to share the concept, maybe bounce it off of YouTube, see if anyone wants to test it on their own and maybe come up with their own conclusions. Well, I did create the list. This list is very heavily based on the skeleton from David Stern from 2010 Worlds, top 32 Flyterra list, and from that, innovations from James G's Flyterra list that he built. So shout out to @2010Decklists on Twitter, James G, for creating the Flyterra build that this is very, very inspired by. It's very close to Flygon Torterra and Flygon Dusknoir builds from James G. Basically, I've been working with Flygon piles lately because I've had some extra Flygon pieces laying around, so it's like, okay, let's make another Flygon deck for 2010 Worlds for my gauntlet. Flygon decks are really fun. There's always a lot of hard decisions on both sides of the board to be made when you're playing Flygon, so I just really enjoy the deck. So let's get right into it. Starting off, any good Flygon deck, sorry David, I'm crawling on your list here a little bit, but any good Flygon deck needs to start with 3 copies of Spiritomb. Either 3 or 4 works. I prefer 3 because that is enough. So Spiritomb is used for its Keystone Seal, which locks each player's trainer cards. In this format, trainers are items. So rare candy or ball search cards, Pokemon communication, things like that are locked out. We don't play too many items, but the decks that we're going to be playing against, a lot of times like SP, are going to want to play a lot of items. Crucially, Keystone Seal allows the blockage of the use of Power Spray, which is an SP card that stops you from using Poke Powers. And because it's a trainer card, if Spiritomb's active, even though it's not during your turn, it's blocking the trainer card, so you can stop the, or rather, even though it's not your opponent's turn, it can still block the item from being played. So it's very important. It also has the Darkness Grace attack for free. Search your deck for a Pokemon that evolves from one of your benched Pokemon and put it on that Pokemon to evolve. If you do, put a damage counter on Spiritomb. Really, really fantastic attack. Probably the best single setup attack ever printed. Up there with like Dunsparce from 04, right? Like, we're talking that strong. Just an incredible, incredible attack. The reason we want to play this is so we slow down the opponent. I guess we can also mention Will-O-Wisp for 10. We do have the ability to use that. Well, we're not going to do it. But 60 HP, very relevant because it's very weak to Sableye. So if you're playing against a Sableye deck, we have another starter that you can use against those. But Spiritomb's just really good, slowing down these very trainer-heavy decks and setting up our board, finding our Pokemon out of the deck. One thing I'm going to mention about Spiritomb while we're here, because it will be relevant to the playstyle of this deck on our opponent's side of the board anyway, is Spiritomb has a resistance colorless. Keep this in mind. Keep the trainer lock in mind and keep the resistance colorless in mind, because we're going to be taking advantage of that. Next up, we have 2 copies of Trapinch. This is the Trapinch from Secret Wonders. It has the Inviting Trap attack. Switch the defending Pokemon with one of your opponent's bench. So essentially a boss's orders effect of your choice. Choose one of the bench Pokemon, bring it active. And it's got the Sand Tomb attack, which does 10, and the defending Pokemon cannot retreat during your opponent's next turn. This is a really crucial attack in this deck. We're going to be using it a lot into other matchups against evolution decks. Really, really good attack. Keep it in mind. This is a trapping deck, or a deck that can trap. It can go on both sides of the spectrum, but it can trap really easily. Crucially, we have a resistance to electric, so Luxray GL level X does not kill us with a a Flash Impact. So that is relevant, I suppose. We also play 1 copy of Trapinch from Rising Rivals. This Trapinch has the Gather Sand Poke Power. If it's active, you can search your discard pile for a Fighting Energy and attach it to Trapinch. It's not super, super usable. Frankly, you don't find yourself using it that often, but it is something that exists in the deck, and you can get yourself an energy. One thing you can do is that if in the mid-game you lose a Fighting Energy, we do play 2 of them, you can get that Fighting Energy back, attach a double colorless, then evolve into Flygon with a rare candy, and you're fully charged up to use the attacks. So that is relevant. This deck, as all Flygon decks are, they rely on very slow attaching. So sometimes if you whiff an attachment, that can be really bad. This can help you alleviate the issue, hopefully. It's also got the Grind attack, 10 times the amount of energy attached to Trapinch. You will use it sometimes if it's just like your only attack and you're just starting to do a quick 10 damage, but you're not going to rely on it. Next, we play 2 different Vibrava. We play 1 copy of Vibrava from Secret Wonders. This one has 80 HP, which is relevant, more HP than the other one, but we just play a split so we have more options here. Sandwind does 10 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon for a fighting energy. Not bad for a 1 energy attack, but you're not going to be using this too often. And then Hyper Beam, I've never used this attack. 40, and Flip a Coin if it has discard an energy attached to the defending Pokemon. So, not very relevant. If you're relying on Hyper Beam to win the game, you've probably lost. But also has a unique weakness, so this can't be taken out by Garchomp's Earthquake because it's weak to water, whereas Flygon, or Vibrava rather, from Rising Rivals has a colorless weakness, so it would die to Earthquake. Rising Rivals Flygon, or Vibrava, I keep on messing this up, has the colorless typing, which is relevant because it means we are both hit by weakness on colorless Pokemon from like Garchomp, and we also hit back for colorless weakness. It's got the Energy Typhoon attack, does 20 damage times the number of energy cards in your opponent's discard pile, then shuffle those back into your opponent's deck. So we don't want to be using this too often because we don't want to be putting energy back into the opponent's deck. We are a control, like, mill deck. So the more energy we mill, the happier we are. We don't want to be giving them back to our opponent necessarily. But as a finishing option, it's something you can use. I've heard legends of this attack taking big KOs before. We've also got Quick Attack. Flip a Coin if heads does 20 plus 20 more for 40 damage. This attack is actually relevant. You don't want to be doing this, but if you attach an Expert Belt, Quick Attack will do 40 damage, 60 if you get a heads, and 40 damage if you get a tails will knock out Garchomp C, and 60 damage if you get a heads will knock out Garchomp C level X with weakness. So keep that in mind, I suppose. We play a Flygon split as well, if you haven't caught on yet. We'll start with the more important Flygon first, I suppose. So we play 2 copies of Flygon from Rising Rivals. Rising Rivals Flygon has the Rainbow Float Pokebody. If any basic energy card attached to Flygon is the same attached to the Pokemon in play, so like, I worded that wrong. If any basic energy attached to Flygon is the same type as any of your Pokemon in play, the retreat cost for the Pokemon is 0. So if I have a grass energy attached to Flygon, all my grass Pokemon get free retreat. In this deck we play Fighting, Psychic, Dark, and Metal energy. So we can get all those free retreats with Rainbow Float. It's got 2 awesome attacks. Sandwall, 40 damage. Discard a stadium card that your opponent has in play. If you do, prevent all damage done to Flygon during your next turn. All effects of attacks, including damage, sorry. This is really, really good because of level X. We'll talk about this in a bit, but in general, in matchups like Gyarados that they really rely on their stadium, you know, broken time space in that matchup, they really like their broken time space. If you can just like harass them and you know, mill their broken time space while like getting some chip in there, that's really, really relevant, so keep that in mind. I forgot to mention we're weak to colorless, 120 HP. We do live a Dragon Rush, because Dragon Rush will do 110 after weakness, but it's very easy for Garchomp to KO, so you don't want to be attacking with this. Even though Sandwall does KO a Garchomp C, if you're not getting that immunity, be very, very careful about attacking into Garchomps, or any like SP deck that even has a Garchomp on the board, because in one turn that can go and knock you out, so be careful. We also have the Power Swing attack, 60 plus 10 for each evolved Pokemon on your bench. This is just a very high damage attack, especially for colorless energy. If you look at like the other 3 energy attacks in this format, like Shadow Skip and Psychic Lock, they're doing base 60 with an added effect. This is doing 60 plus. Typically, you're going to hit for like 80 damage, 90 damage, which is still really good if with an Expert Belt that's like hitting 110. Again, be very careful with your placements of those because, you know, Garchomp can just come in and nuke you. This Flygon's a very dangerous attacker, and playing Flygon decks in general always feels like a gamble because Flygon is very risky to play against Garchomp, but this deck has some hopeful alleviations to our issues there. We'll get more into like the synergy of this in a minute, though. We'll talk about the other Flygon first. 1 copy of Flygon from Secret Wonders with the Irritating Buzz Pokebody. This deck is all about its Pokebodies. As long as Flygon's your active Pokemon, put 1 damage counter on each of your opponent's active Pokemon between turns, excluding fighting Pokemon. So ignore the doubles ruling. When it says each active Pokemon, it's referring to double battle rules, which is not a thing we're doing here. Which, I mean, it could be cool if we're doing that, but, you know, we're not. So essentially, this is extra chip, and this is really relevant. Like, you wouldn't think putting 1 damage hunter on the active Pokemon Evo Trainer is relevant. It is very, very relevant. You can even stack this with level X that we're going to talk about in a minute for 2 in-between turn effects for being active. And most things in this format are not fighting type. And hitting that extra 10 damage will set up math really nicely for our next attack, and for Power Swing if you want to pivot into that. We have Sand Sonic for fighting double colorless to 60 plus. If you attach a fighting energy from your hand to Flygon during this turn, it does 60 plus 20 more. So notably, you're only going to be able to do this extra damage probably once. You don't want to over-attach to a Flygon. But doing 80 damage is just really solid. Like I said, base 60 damage is pretty normal for an attack, so this isn't a bad amount of damage even if it's unboosted. But remember that Irritating Buzz is boosting our damage the whole time. This Flygon is notably weaker and harder to use than the Rising Rivals Flygon, but we play it for a key reason. Do you know what that reason is, chat? If you've played 2010 Worlds, you probably know. That reason is Luxray GL level X. Our deck has no way to deal with Luxray GL level X. Torterra decks have like their Torterra from Stormfront in there to deal with it. Our deck really doesn't. Our backup attacker does not do it all well with Luxray. So we have to play a fighting type. You could choose to play a Machamp line in here instead of thickening the Flygon line. You play 1/1/1 Machamp for takeout just to deal with that. But I chose to thicken the Flygon line partly because I don't own Machamp extra right now, and partially because this gives you a lot of options. It thickens your Flygon line, making it easier and more flexible to get these guys into play, which always feels good because Flygon decks are notoriously clunky. So having extra pieces really just feels great. But Irritating Buzz is just really good. It's not the goal of this deck, but it helps take knockouts. So against SP, where we can't really play a deck out game, we're going to be playing knockouts, and this is your best attacker against SP. This thing with an expert belt against SP, they are like shitting themselves because they have to double Dragon Rush it to get rid of it, because there's no other way for them to deal with it unless they're playing like Blaziken or Dialga, things like that, in their Lux Chomp list. So those are our Flygons. Now let's get into the Flygon level X. So 1 copy of Flygon level X. We'll just do that, right? Don't want to take it off the playmat here, but Flygon level X, nice 20 HP boost, notably a 2x weakness. So Garchomp will now not need any modifiers to take a 1-hit knockout with Dragon Rush. It will just do so. So be very careful playing Flygon into SP. But still 140 HP, nice little HP buff against non-colorless decks. We have a Wind Erosion Pokebody as long as Flygon is active. Discard the top card of your opponent's deck between turns. This is the scariest Pokebody in the format, perhaps, up there with Nidoqueen's Maternal Comfort and Dialga's Time Crystal. Wind Erosion is so scary for the opponent's deck to deal with because every turn Flygon's active, it is just milling a card. And this is primarily a mill deck again in some matchups. In some matchups, you are just not going to not be able to overpower the opponent with attackers. You're going to go for mill. So Wind Erosion is a huge part of this deck. We also have Extreme Attack for 3 colorless energy. Choose one of your opponent's Pokemon level X. It does 150 damage to that Pokemon. 150 damage anywhere on the opponent's field on a level X is absolutely nuts. You should know this if you're in the format. 150 snipe. We just talked about how these attacks do like 60 to 90 damage, right? This thing does 150. Very, very good. Also removes the retreat cost. The Flygon from Secret Wonders has a retreat cost of 1. This one has a retreat cost of 0, so that's relevant to keep in mind. Yeah, relevant. So, what is the mill strategy we're talking about? I talked about the Trapinch earlier with its Inviting Trap and its Sand Tomb. We're mainly worried about Sand Tomb here. Sand Tomb does 10 and prevents the opponent from retreating. And remember how I talked about Spirit Tomb earlier? Well, Spirit Tomb is a Pokemon that has a colorless resistance. So if we're hitting Spirit Tomb with Flygon level X, copying Sand Tomb, they are taking 0 damage. So they're not escaping the active, and they can't use Warp Point to get them out of the active. The only way to get a Spirit Tomb out then is to kill itself or to Warp Energy it. And if they Warp Energy it, we're going to bring it back up and start doing it again. So that is the mill strategy of the deck. We also have a potential to, stall with Sandwall. I talked about Sandwall earlier, how it discards Stadium and gets immunity. If you can get a turn against like a Gyarados deck where you just remove their Stadium and then mill 2 cards in between the turns with Wind Erosion, that's super sick. That's a good turn if you ask me, so keep that in mind. Next, we're going to talk about our secondary line. We're going to start our second row here, and we'll get back to the first row for the thinner lines. Next up, we have our Metagross line. This is MetaGon, after all. So let's talk about Metagross line. We have 2 copies of Beldum from Legends Awakened. This is the Beldum with a retreat cost of 1. There's 2 different Beldums in this format that we're not playing. There's one that searches a Stadium for 1 energy, and we don't have any Stadiums. And there's one that grabs another Beldum from the deck when you attach a Metal energy to it. Off of a coin flip, I believe, which is really, really, really good, but we only play 2 Beldum, and it has a retreat cost of 2. We want the retreat cost of 1 so that we can move into Spiritomb. This Beldum also has 2 decent attacks. For 1 colorless energy, Allure, draw a card. If it's your turn 1 attack, it's not a bad turn 1 attack. Just attach an energy and draw a card, right? Not bad. And then Tackle for 2 is pretty bad. We have a Metang. This Metang is definitely the best one, and that is because of Metallic Lift. Pokebody, if Metang has any metal energy attached to it, its retreat cost is 0. So obviously we have Flygon to remove retreat cost, but we're not always going to be able to get Flygon into play early. So let's just say we start Beldum, and it's turn 2, we evolve into Metang, attach a metal energy, and then we can free retreat into our Spiritomb and set up the lock. That's a pretty ideal turn 2, all things considered. So Metallic Lift, really good. We also have Psychic, pretty decent attack in some situations. Does 40 plus 10 for each energy attached to the defending Pokemon. So if your opponent's playing like a tank deck like Hippowdon, we'd probably win that matchup anyway, but like think of like the energy stacking decks like Hippowdon and Steelix and Tangrowth. These decks are just going to put like a crap ton of energy on their attacker. You can do a lot of damage with this. Notable that we can actually copy this while we're at Metagross within a tool card we play, so do keep the attack in mind even if you are already a Metagross. It's not a bad attack, but considering Metal doesn't hit weakness on anything, it's not a great attack either. Speaking of not great attacks, we have our next piece of the deck, which is Metagross. This is the Metagross of choice. There is no level X for Metagross, unfortunately. We would love it if there was. So, Metagross has the Magnetic Reversal Pokepower. This is why we play it. It says, once during your turn, you may flip a coin. If heads, choose one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and switch it with the defending Pokemon. So this is Pokemon Catcher on a Pokepower, and you can do this multiple times. Obviously, because it's a Pokepower, it doesn't work if Metagross is affected by special conditions, and it doesn't work if your opponent locks your Pokepowers either. So keep that in mind. Why is Metagross so good, though? Because, like I said with Spiritomb before, we can drag it up with Metallic Reversal if it's on your opponent's bench, and then trap it with Flygon and start milling them. Against evolution decks, especially Curse-Guard, decks that we're not going to beat in a traditional manner, this is going to be your style of play. You're just going to mill them out. Because you can't beat them in a normal way, unfortunately. Curse-Guard is just a bad matchup if you're attacking into it with this deck. We don't have a lot of Pokepowers, so they can't like Shadow Room us that easily, but they're just going to just make things very uncomfortable for us. So we just have to take advantage of their Spiritombs by locking them. Obviously, they can shuffle away your level X, but then you just get the level X back and play and nuke their Gengar level X, and it's a positive trade in that regard. So you can still trap it even without the level X. You're just not milling them. Notable, don't trap with this, the Sand Damage Flygon, because they're taking damage, unless that's your goal. You don't want to trap Spiritombs with Sand Damage, basically. It also has the extra Comet Punch attack, does 50 if you used extra Comet Punch during your last turn. This attack's base damage is 100 instead, and 100 is a lot of damage. However, it only works if Metagross stays active. If your opponent switches Metagross with a Luxray GL level X or a Warp Point, anything that forces you to the bench, the effect is reset, so you do not get to use it like that. But it is pretty decent. You know, 120 HP isn't that bulky, but it's a different weakness. It's not weak to Garchomp. Is weak to Blaziken, unfortunately. So you just pretty much, you're not doing well against Blaziken, Luxchomp, just because they're hitting all sides of your weakness and resistance spectrum. But extra Comet Punch, occasionally useful. I like to threaten this on turns where I'm just like milling a card with Flygon and like not doing much. I'd rather extra Comet Punch and threaten to hit for 100 next turn while preserving my Flygon on the bench. It's a good attacker into Gardevoir because Gardevoir, Psychic type hits into that resistance, so you're only taking 40 from Psychic Lock. And this damage can just get really out of hand, especially if you target down their Nidoqueen and remove their stadiums. They don't like that, and I do like that. So Metagross, pretty cool. Why do we play this, though? It's because it synergizes with Flygon's Mill. The attacks are just alright. It synergizes with Flygon's Mill. Gust in a Flygon deck is horrifying. Obviously, Flyterra has that in a way, but this deck doesn't. So speaking of this deck's Lux Chomp matchup, we're going to cover this before we go to the rest of the pieces. Kind of like, in the scale of Flygon decks, there's 4 Flygon decks mainly for this format that I'll consider. Flygon Machamp, Flygon Torterra, Flygon Metagross, and Flygon Dusknoir. Flygon decks are notorious for having a less than advantageable matchup into Lux Chomp decks. It's usually like maximum like 45% if you're playing like Flygon Machamp, I'd say. And then it goes down from there slightly into like 40%. And like Flygon Dusknoir just has like a pretty abysmal Lux Chomp matchup because it's just not meant for that. It's meant to stop evolutions. I think this one falls. It's lower than Flyterra. Like, it doesn't have that infinite healing tech that just auto-wins non-Blaziken variants if you get it set up. But this deck is definitely not as good as, like, Machamp, and it's not as bad as Dusknoir, though, into Lux Chomp in specific. I think Dusknoir is a little bit better specifically into evolution decks than this one is, but this one falls in the middle of, like, Torterra and Dusknoir. Like, in that middle spot of, like, it deals better with Lux Chomp than Dusknoir, but worse than evolution decks. Worse in evolution decks than the Dusknoir. So, anyway, next up we have a 2-2 Claydol line. We'll just do that over here. Starting off, we have 2 copies of Baltoy. We do play Fighting Baltoy because we don't play any special tricks for the Psychic one. Psychic Balance, if you have less cards in hand to your opponent, then draw up to the amount of cards in your hand as your opponent has. Not a bad turn 1 attack. And Spin Turn, don't use it. 20 damage, switch Baltoy at the bench. I guess you can switch into a Spiritomb, but you do not want 2 energy on a Baltoy. Next up, we have 2 copies of Claydol. Claydol's got the Cosmic Power. Once during your turn, you may choose up to 2 cards from your hand, put them on your back, bottom of your deck, and then draw up to 6 in hand. Really, really good. Like I said, Spiritomb blocks the Power Spray Trainer card from being played, so we get to freely Claydol as long as we are smart against SP for the beginning of the game, which is really good, just helping you set up your board. So that's why Claydol is here. A lot of times Claydol is going to go down in the mid to late game. Even sometimes early game, they're going to try to shoot your Claydol immediately. If you're not prepared, they're going to trap your Claydol, so be prepared. Notably, we do play Fighting Energy, so Rainbow Float Flygon will give it free retreat if they just gust it to the active and leave it there with nothing else. Next up, we play a 1-1 Honchkrow line. We'll talk about the individual parts here. Murkrow, 50 HP, has the Dusk Stone, so it can evolve the turn you play it. This is why we play this Murkrow, because it can evolve the turn you play it on the held item. It does have Feint Attack, but you're not attaching 2 energy to this guy, promise. Then we have Honchkrow. Honchkrow has the Darkness Restore Pokepower. If Honchkrow is your active Pokemon and your opponent's bench isn't full, you may use this power, search your opponent's discard pile for a basic Pokemon and put it onto the bench, and then that is all. This is really good, and what this does for this deck is it traps Spiritombs. So against evolution decks, either if they start Spiritomb, if they put Spiritomb down, or even if they don't, we're going to make a position where we can mill a Spiritomb with Flygon, and then we're going to bring it onto the bench and bring it active with Metagross in the same turn, and trap it with Flygon. We have a couple switching cards in this deck to help with that, but essentially the goal is to just bring something like a Sableye or a Spiritomb into play so you can trap it infinitely with Flygon. It also does have a usable attack in here. Riot does 30 plus 10 for each Pokemon that isn't an evolved Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent's. Because most of our deck is evolved, you're not going to be hitting very hard with this, but against a deck like Lux Chomp, you might be able to get a nice 80 damage attack off. Though I wouldn't recommend attacking with this too often. So moving on, we have the nice few one-of techs here to talk about. We have 1 copy of Azelf with Time Walk. If you've played the format, you know what Azelf does. Look at your opponent's, look at your prize cards, grab a Pokemon there, reveal it to your opponent, and put it into your hand. Then put another card from your hand, which could also be the Pokemon. It doesn't have to be another card. Just put a card from your hand into your prize cards. You don't have to shuffle your prize cards, so Azelf not only gets you a Pokemon from your prize cards, but also maps your prize cards for the rest of the game. Really good. We also have Lock of Attack, does 20. The defending Pokemon can't retreat. Because we select Psychic Energy, it's worth mentioning. Next up we have one copy of Uxie. Has 70 HP as well. Setup Pokepower. When you play Uxie from your hand onto your bench, you may draw until you have 7 cards in hand. We're not going to use Uxie too often in this deck. Like, setup is really good, don't get me wrong. But the games you're playing Uxie, you're probably not doing very well. But it is there as an emergency draw to try to hit what you need in the late game as well as just being, you know, if you have nothing, just throw a Hail Mary in a Uxie and hopefully get it off your board before it becomes an issue. Next up, we have one copy of Unknown G. Every deck, I feel like, should play Unknown G, but not every deck has space. Thankfully, we do. Unknown G has the Guard Pokepower. If it's on your bench, you may attach it as a tool card to one of your Pokemon. Prevent all effects of attacks done to the Pokemon that Unknown G is attached to as a tool card. So, in this deck, there's a lot of things we can do this with. If you're playing against a deck with Blaziken or Frostlass GL, you can put the Unknown on Claydol, preventing it from being gusted up to the active spot and trapped. If we're playing against a SP deck, it's also very relevant to put an Unknown G on something like a Metagross or a Flygon so that they do not get their energy moved by Ambipom G's Tail Code. You don't want to get it trapped by Poison Bind, maybe, so maybe you preemptively put it on something you're pivoting in, like a Metagross. Really, you could, like, I mean, I'd love to play 2 in this deck, but we just don't have the space. So we make do with 1 and a recovery card if we need a second one. It also has Hidden Power, 50 damage, but if Unknown G has any damage counters on it, this text-based damage is 10. Don't use this attack, unless you're winning the game. And lastly, we have one copy of Bronzong E4. This was a tech scene in David Stern's Worlds list, and it's still so good. You have to play this card. There's a little bit of dust there. That's bothering me. So, it has 90 HP, which is very high for a setup Pokemon, and the Hand Refresh attack. Each player shuffles his or her hand into his or her deck and then draws 4 cards. So this is really, really good because against like SP and Gyarados, this gives us a nice setup Pokemon that's going to disrupt their hand. And especially Gyarados with Sableye, they end their turn by getting a supporter card off of Sableye. And a lot of times then their supporter card, you know, Felicity can still discard cards, which is helpful, but their supporter card is going to be worthless if you're shuffling whatever they find off their supporter card into the deck. Obviously, it depends on decks. Some decks play different supporter cards. Most decks don't. Most Gyarados decks are going to play like the same 4 supporter cards consistently, and those are cards that don't like to see Hand Refresh. So it's a nice judge effect, because otherwise this deck doesn't have a way to Hand Disrupt. So it's nice to have a way to Hand Disrupt. I won my game against SP the other day. I went 1-1 against SP, and I won a game against Gardevoir when testing this the other day. I won with Hand Refresh in the late game because it helped me find the card I need after shuffling stuff back into the deck. So I Uxied for my Night Maintenance. This was like last turn of the game. I Uxied for my Night Maintenance, Expert Belted the Uxie to make it live longer, and then I Hand Refreshed, and I was able to draw into the card I needed off of the Night Maintenance that I shuffled in. So is really good. One thing I'll also note is against Sableye decks, where they play the special Darkness Energy and Sableye as an attacker, those things maul Spiritombs like a toddler getting mauled by a pit bull. So you're going to need an attacker, or a setup Pokemon rather, with more bulk on its side than Spiritomb. Sorry friend, I love Spiritomb, you're my favorite card in the format. But pit bulls are not nice to toddlers, and neither are Sableye's Spiritombs. It is a slaughter, so bring your 90 HP Bronzong friend. They are very safe against Sableye's. It also has the Payback attack. If you only have, or if your opponent only has 1 prize remaining, does 10 plus 50, and the defending Pokemon is now confused. I've had opportunities where this attack might come up, but I've never actually used it. I will say that if you Expert Belt this, and your opponent has 1 prize card remaining, it will do 110 damage with weakness to a Gardevoir or a Gallade, which is pretty decent math, I might say. Also can KO Uxie, things like that. The supporter line's pretty basic, so we'll go through it pretty fast. Nothing too special here. Pretty stable Flygon deck stuff. So, 4 copies of Roseanne's Research. Search your deck for up to 2 in any combination of basic Pokemon and basic energy cards and put them into your hand. Just gets us set up. Notably, you can get a basic energy and a Spiritomb, attach the basic energy to your active and retreat into Spiritomb, and that's a pretty good turn 1 if you're doing that. Turn 1 going second. Just really strong. Also just gets your basic energy for Flygon's Rainbow Float, gets your basic energy so you can attack. it's really good. Play this over Collector. Collector's bad in Flygon. You want to play Roseanne's Research in Flygon decks. Next up, we have 4 copies of Bebe Search. Choose a card from hand, put it on top of your deck, then search your deck for a Pokemon. Really good for finding our evolution Pokemon. A lot of times, let's just say turn 1, you Roseanne, and you Spirit Tomb, and you get out like a Metang or a Vibrava. Turn 2, you can Bebe Search and get out the Flygon or Metagross. I will say, getting out Metagross early, it's not like a great attacker necessarily. It's going to finish your game and get you started even, but the sooner you can start harassing the opponent, maybe baiting out some power sprays with your magnetic reversal, the better, because the opponent does not like getting gusted. Even if you're just gusting to like gust up things they don't like and like just leave it there, it's still like good disruption and good harassment. So if you can get that Metagross in play early with Bebe, not a bad strategy at all. 3 copies of Professor Oak's New Theory, pretty staple in Flygon decks these days. Shuffle your hand, draw 6. We want to play Judge, but we need more consistency, so we play Professor Oak's New Theory because it helps us find our cards more consistently. Going on to the trainer cards here, we have 3 copies of Rare Candy. You could play 4. I decided to cut the count to 3 so I could add another card into the deck, which we'll talk about its reasoning. So choose one of your basic Pokemon. If you have Stage 1 or Stage 2 in your hand that evolves from that Pokemon, put it on that card to evolve. So notably, compared to new Rare Candy, if you've never played with the old rules of Rare Candy, you can evolve into a Stage 1 or Stage 2, and you can evolve this during your first turn going second, or the turn a Pokemon was put into play. So, really strong card. Absolutely should be in every Stage 2 deck in this format. Even BTS decks, you need Rare Candy. It's just too good to ignore. 1 copy of Pokemon Communication. Choose a Pokemon from your hand, show it to your opponent, put it on top of your deck. If you do, search your deck for a Pokemon and put it into your hand. This is really good. Notably, we have a level X card, so we might as well play this so we can search that out, as well as Bebe Search can search it out. But it's just nice to have Pokemon Search in the deck. And we play 1 copy of Luxury Ball. Search your deck for a Pokemon excluding level X and put it into your hand. If you have any Luxury Ball in your discard pile, you can't play this card. So we would play 2 if we could, but you can't, so you don't. Searching any Pokemon is pretty good, especially if you can fulfill a Candy combo by finding the basic or Stage 2 piece you need for the Candy combo. Then we have 1 copy of Warp Point. Warp Point says, your opponent switches one of their Pokemon with one of their benched, and then you switch your active on your bench. It's nice to have this in general, just because extra escapes from the tyranny of Luxchomp trapping. But the main reason this is in the deck, and this is a very unique point, I took this from James G's Flygon Dusknoir list, because most Flygon lists do not play Warp Point. I play this because of Honchkrow. So essentially, Honchkrow needs to be active for its Darkness Restore Pokepower to work. So how do we get to get Honchkrow in the active and retreat it in a single turn? We use Warp Point or Warp Energy. So we need an extra Warp effect in there so we can get 2 switches off in a turn. You could just play a copy of Switch, but Warp Point's nice having some form of disruption on the opponent as well. Is ideal. You could just like play Switch, like I said, but I like having options with Warp Point. Warp Point's good. Good card. So yeah, get Honchkrow in the active with Warp Point, then either retreat it for an energy or free retreat it with Flygon's Rainbow Float to get it out after you've used the Pokepower. It's pretty good. One thing I did forget to mention about the Honchkrow Pokepower is against Gyarados, you can just put Magikarps onto their bench and then they do less damage, which is hilarious. Obviously, they can try to pick them up and salvage that play, but if you can just do that like twice, they're not doing any damage, so keep that in mind. Next up, this is the most flexible copy. If you want to put 2 of this in here, I completely understand, but I just put 1. 1 copy of Night Maintenance. Shuffle 3 name combination of Pokemon and basic energy cards from your discard pile into your deck. It's Super Rod if you play the game nowadays. It's literally just Super Rod. We need recovery. Ideally, like, I would love a second recovery card, either another Night Maintenance or a Premier Ball to get Flygon back specifically, but 1 works fine. You just have to be very careful with how you play this. This is not a card you burn, ever. This is a card that you very tactically use to get the cards exactly back that you're going to need to win the game. And if you get a card back that's wrong with your 1 copy of Night Maintenance, you're going to pay for it. So be very careful. Is relevant to keep in mind. Usually going to get Flygon level X back as one of your cards, maybe Unknown G. Those are 2 really valuable one-ofs to keep in mind. Next up, we have 2 copies of Expert Belt. So Expert Belt says, the Pokemon this card is attached to gets 20 more HP and does 20 more damage. When the Pokemon's knocked out, though, your opponent takes one more prize card. This is a card that I can be convinced to go down to one copy of, because this isn't as much of an attacking deck as something like Flyterra that needs to for its Giga Drain Torterra. But I like having to. For one, it makes it easier to find, and for two, it allows me to do late game plays like I did in the game the other day, where I expert belted a Uxie to prevent it from being Dragon Rush for knockout and the crucial last turn of the game. Usually you're attaching this to your Fighting Flygon or your Metagross just to get some extra damage in there. Metagross with an expert belt is pretty scary into Psychic decks, whereas Fighting Flygon with an expert belt is scary into SP decks that don't have a way to deal with it, because water weakness is pretty awkward for SP. Obviously, be very careful with your expert belt, because if you just give up 2 prizes in a one-shot, then you've probably lost the game. One copy of Memory Berry. This is a card that I didn't see in David Stern's list, and it worries me because this is one of the best cards in the deck. Memory Berry, if it's attached to a Pokemon, that Pokemon can use the attack from its basic or Stage 1 evolution card. You only need 1 copy, but you need 1 copy. And what we do with this is we attach it to Flygon, and it allows us to copy Trapinch's Sand Tomb to trap things. You potentially actually switch this to a 2-1 Memory Berry count, but I think this is fine as is. Notably that you just want to be able to copy Sand Tomb with Flygon. There's also some little shenanigans I talked about before where you can copy like the Metang Psychic. A fun play you can do, maybe not the best play, is you can copy Vibrava's Sandwind in combination with the Fighting Flygon. You're damaging the active for 10 in between turns, and you're spreading 10 to everything on the board. Don't do that, preferably, but it is funny to think about. Yeah, you need 1 copy, though. Notably with Gust, this allows us to, bring Spiritomb up, copy the attack, trap it. That's the combo against a lot of evolution decks. If we can't out-offense them, we're going to mill them. Next up, we play 4 copies of Double Colorless Energy. Double Colorless Energy counts as 2 Colorless Energy, and we play a maxed 4 count because Metagross needs Colorless Energy, Flygon needs Double Colorless Energy. So both of our attackers do. In Flygon Dusknoir, you only need 3 because Dusknoir only has like 1 attacker that uses Double Colorless. In the Stormfront Dusknoir, that snipes damage on the board. Everything in this deck needs Double Colorless. So play that. Notably, you can also retreat with it if you don't have a Fighting on Flygon for when your Claydol gets trapped, or if your Bronzong gets trapped active. In the game last time I played, I retreated a Bronzong for 4 energy with 2 Double Colorless, so that was relevant. Very cool to see. So what did I cut the card for the 4th rare candy? That's a good question. I'm going to answer it for you. 3 copies of Metal Energy. I play an extra Metal Energy in here. Originally played 2. I think you need 3. And my reasoning behind this is that you're always going to need 1 on Flygon for Metagross to retreat, and you're always going to need 1 on Metagross so it can attack. You want that extra slot just in case one's prized. Think of decks like Flyterra. They always play 3 as well. This was my reasoning behind this. If you're not playing 3, you're not going to be able to attack with Metagross. Or not going to be able to free retreat it, and either one of those is like a death sentence to this deck. 3 copies is good. You don't need 4. 2 copies of Fighting Energy. Fighting Energy allows us to retreat our Claydolls and also our Fighting Flygon for free. It also allows us to attack with Fighting Flygon Sand Sonic. Do keep in mind that you're usually only going to use the effect of that to boost the damage once, but it's relevant to keep in mind, I think. I have used the attack with boosted damage. It was relevant. It was cool, and I love that card. 1 copy of Psychic Energy. This allows us to retreat our Bronzong and our Uxie Azelf. This is probably the most cuttable card in the deck, but if you're not playing Psychic Energy, it's hard to play Bronzong, so keep that in mind. It's also can pay for the attacks of Azelf, so there's something there. It's nice to also just have an attachment you can throw somewhere. 1 copy of Dark Energy. Oh, this one's a little dirty. There we go. 1 copy of Dark Energy. This one pays the cost of Honchkrow. Usually I wouldn't play a Dark Energy in a Flygon deck, even if it's playing Spiritomb, because it's nice to retreat Spiritomb for free, but ultimately this is for Honchkrow, because we need to put Honchkrow into the active and retreat it in the same turn for free. So Warp Point into Honchkrow, Darkness Energy on Flygon for free retreat, get Honchkrow out of there after he uses Poke's power. And lastly, 1 copy of Warp Energy. This acts as another Warp card. You could potentially cut Warp Point, but I like having both of them in here because this gives us 2 outs to do it, and we don't have to waste our attachment for turn every time we use Honchkrow. meaning we can actually do the Honchkrow thing twice as well. First time with Warp Point, second time with Warp Energy on whichever guy we switch. Warp Energy, when you attach it, switches your active with your bench. So attach to your active, switch with the bench. Also good for getting Metagross out of trapping if you don't have your free retreat Flygon in play. Bronzong out of trapping, Claydol out of trapping. Spiritomb out of trapping. It's our only way to get Spiritomb out of an opposing Flygon lock. So keep that in mind. Against opposing Flygon decks, if they're not playing Warp Energy, you just practically win the game. So that's kind of nice to keep in mind. Anyway, that's been MetaGon. This is kind of an innovative deck. Obviously, the format is 13-year-old. Someone's probably tried this idea before, but I think this list is pretty close to ideal. It's really got everything teched out the way I want it to, and it's played pretty well from my few games of experience. If you have any recommendations for the deck, maybe you want to try it out yourself, here's the list for you. Leave any comments about the deck in the comment section down below. Of course, stay tuned for more Retro Tabletop content pretty soon.